How the hell did it come to this point? I wasn't always like this. I wasn't always the type of person to ignore red flags, to blindly step into danger because it was convenient. But life had a way of whittling me down, of pushing me to the edge where I couldn't see the boundaries anymore. My name is Jason. I'm 22, an introvert. And if I'm being honest, I've never been the kind of person who's good at getting ahead. While other students were joining clubs, networking, and grabbing internships, I was holed up in my dorm, buried in textbooks and late-night study sessions. Most of my friends were people I saw in passing, classmates who had the energy to hang out but not the time to truly connect. My world was small and my college life was dominated by a constant, gnawing fear I was going to fail. It wasn't just the pressure of exams or grades. The looming weight of debt had begun to crush me. I had applied for dozens of part-time jobs, but it always felt like my applications just got lost in a void. The student loans were stacking up, my rent was barely manageable, and the job market felt increasingly hostile to someone with little experience and no connections. I had done everything I could to get by, but at the end of the day, I was just scraping the surface of survival. That was when I saw the job listing for night security guard at a science research institute. I remember reading it, my eyes glued to the screen, each word offering a strange glimmer of hope. A night job monitoring security cameras, high pay, immediate start bar. I hesitated for only a moment. I didn't even care about the details. It seemed too perfect. I needed cash. I needed out of this suffocating spiral. I applied immediately, not thinking twice about the strange lack of information in the ad or the mysteriousness of the facility. It was an opportunity. The call came 2 days later. The man on the other end of the line didn't introduce himself, just stated my interview would be held that evening at 6 p.m. at the Research Institute. The way he said it made it sound less like an invitation and more like an ultimatum. I was a little nervous when I arrived. The institute was nestled in a remote part of town, tucked between dense trees that seemed to swallow up any trace of light. The road leading up to it was long, curving, and completely isolated from the main city. As I walked up to the front entrance, I could feel the weight of the place. The sterile, impersonal building with its bright, cold exterior felt like something out of a dystopian novel. Inside, the air was heavy, thick with the faint scent of antiseptic and old paper. The floors gleamed with clinical precision. I found myself in a sparse, minimalist lobby, waiting for someone to greet me. It wasn't long before a man named Mr. Scard appeared. He was tall, he wore a black suit with a purple tie. His face sharp and angular, his eyes sharp like a hawk's but devoid of any real warmth. His stiff movements seemed deliberate, every gesture measured, as if his entire body was a mechanism calibrated for efficiency. When he shook my hand, it was firm, cold, almost robotic. "You've no prior security experience," he said, eyeing my resume. "I don't, but I'm a quick learner. I'm good at paying attention to detail. I think I can handle monitoring the cameras." Scard stared at me for a long moment. His silence felt suffocating, like I had just failed some test that I hadn't even known existed. Finally, he nodded. "You start tonight." He handed me a piece of paper to sign. His lack of any real questioning seemed strange to me, but I didn't want to question my luck. The pay was far better than anything he'd seen, and the job seemed easy enough. Monitor security cameras in an isolated research facility during the night shift. He handed me a set of keys, then pushed an envelope across the desk. "Read these when you get there. Don't fail to follow the rules. Also, you must work here for 3 weeks before deciding if you want to quit." I signed the contract he gave me and handed it back to him. Without another word, he stood up and walked out, leaving me sitting there, feeling like I was just a cog in a much larger machine. I remember walking through the halls of the institute for the first time. The entire place was eerily quiet. I did see a few researchers briefly, but they were focused on their work. Few eyed me down and then frowned. I looked away. Everything about this facility made me feel out of place. The lights buzzed faintly above me as I made my way to the security booth. It was a small, unassuming room tucked at the back of the facility, filled with monitors and equipment. I sat down, feeling a sense of isolation that seemed to cling to the air itself. The envelope Scard had given me weighed heavily in my pocket. As I opened it, I found a list of rules, 7 rules in total. Rule 1. Lock the door when you enter for your security shifty. Never answer the door to anyone. Only Mr. Scard has access to that room. Lock the door? Sounded like a basic security measure, but there was an underlying sense of finality to it. There was something about the phrase, only Mr. Scard, that was unusual. Rule 2. If you hear whistling, run to the nearest bathroom and hide until it stops. I paused, rereading that one several times. The words hide seemed out of place. The rules grew stranger with each one. Rule 3. If you see a faceless man on one of the security cameras, call the inspector immediately. He will handle the anomaly. If you can't get a hold of him, go to the electrical room on the 2nd floor of the building and pray it doesn't find you. I was genuinely confused by this one. Faceless man? What the hell? I quietly read each sentence, trying to decipher and understand all this. Rule 4. Under no circumstances talk to the other researchers or scientists, besides Mr. Scard. Rule 5. Never fall asleep on the job. At least Rule 4 and 5 were more normal. Made me wonder if this was some sort of prank for being the new employee. Rule 6. If your security cameras suddenly turn off, contact Mr. Scard immediately. He will give you further instructions that will save your life. Rule 7. If black liquid starts filling the security room, don't touch the ground, and stay very still and quiet until it disappears. I tried to brush off the strange feeling creeping up on me. Instructions to save my life, black liquid. I thought to myself, wow. The only conclusion that made logical sense was this was some sort of prank. I guess Scard has a sense of humor after all. No, I needed the job, and the pay. The pay was good enough to ignore my unease and the weirdness surrounding this job. I nervously laughed it off and then proceeded to complete the tasks set before me. After a week of shifts, I started to feel more comfortable. The monotony of watching security cameras in the small, windowless room became a kind of routine. I still kept the rules in mind, still thinking they were some joke. However, Rule 3 and 7 seemed most unnerving, but the more I worked, the easier it was to put it all out of my mind. On the weekend, I met up with a few of my friends from college. They hadn't seen me in a while, and as usual, the conversation quickly turned to the usual topics: school, upcoming exams, the endless stress of being in our last year. "How's the job going?" Ryan asked, leaning back in his chair. His dark hair was disheveled and gave me his usual smile. "I hope the job isn't too taxing." He chuckled. I shrugged, trying to sound casual. "It's fine. It's just watching cameras at night. No big deal." I forced a laugh. "Nah, it's just a job. I'm making decent money. Nothing crazy like that." But the moment I said it, I felt like I was lying to myself. Something about the institute didn't sit right. I didn't want to admit it to my friends, but there was a dark undercurrent to the place, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end every time I walked through the empty halls. Ryan noticed my hesitation. "You're not thinking of quitting already, are you?" I shook my head quickly. "No. Just tired. Late nights and all that." We changed the subject, but in the back of my mind, I kept returning to that eerie feeling, the whistling, the faceless man on the cameras, the rules that didn't make sense. I understood what it meant to be alone in the dark. I was used to the quiet of night, the hum of streetlights just outside my dorm window, the steady tick-tock of my clock. But the isolation inside the research institute was something else entirely. At first, everything was manageable. The job was routine, watching the security cameras, monitoring the empty halls, keeping an eye out for anything suspicious. The stillness of the place made it feel like I was part of something important, like I was guarding a secret that no one else knew. It wasn't until the 8th night, after I had settled into a rhythm, that the first incident happened. The cameras themselves never seemed to glitch, but there was a pervasive feeling that something was just slightly off. It started with the small things, scratching sounds that I couldn't identify, flickering lights in the hallways. At first, I brushed it off. It was an older building. Old buildings creak. That was all. Then, around midnight, it happened. I was sitting in front of the security monitors, half dazed from the repetitive nature of the job. I had my phone in my lap, scrolling through social media, trying to pass the time. My eyes kept flicking to the screens, instinctively checking the feed. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow in the corner of the camera feed. It looked like someone walking down the hall, their movements stiff and jerky, but it wasn't the way anyone walks. The figure's movements were mechanical, like the steps of a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. He was tall, wearing a long white coat, probably one of the researchers. But something wasn't right. I leaned in closer to the screen, my heart thudding in my chest. The man was moving toward the camera, closer and closer. And then, his face. His face was smooth, completely featureless. There were no eyes, no mouth, no nose, just skin. A blank, unmarked surface where a face should have been in. I felt a coldness seep through my bones, like something was wrong in the most primal way possible. My breath hitched. This isn't real. I told myself, it's just a glitch. It has to be. But as I stared at the feed, I realized the figure was coming closer to the security booth. He was walking directly toward me. Panic surged in my chest. I could feel my heart racing, the fear spreading through my veins like a fire. I scrambled to grab the phone, my hands shaking as I dialed the number Scott had given me for emergencies. The inspector's line. It rang once, twice, 3 times. No answer. I swallowed hard, trying to push down the panic rising in my throat. Think, Kason, think. I looked at the map of the building on the monitor, trying to steady my hands. The electrical room was on the 2nd floor. It was my only option. I had to get there. I had to follow Rule 3, as absurd as this all was. I stood up, but the moment I moved, the lights overhead flickered and went out. The entire building plunged into darkness, the monitors going black in an instant. My stomach dropped. This was wrong. I could feel it now, the presence in the building. Something was moving, something that wasn't supposed to be here. I bolted from the booth, rushing down the hall, my feet slapping against the polished floor. The silence was deafening. Every step I took seemed to echo through the empty halls. The air grew thick with an oppressive weight, pressing in on me, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I could feel it. The thing from the camera feed was following me. As I reached the stairwell, I hesitated. I glanced back. There was no one there, but I could hear the faintest sound of breathing, slow and deliberate. The sound was coming from behind me, as if it were watching me from 15 feet behind me. I quickly went up the stairs, trying not to let the terror drown me. I couldn't panic. I just need to get to the electrical room. The 2nd floor was darker than the rest of the building, as though the shadows themselves were deeper here. The air was colder. The walls felt like they were closing in on me. I reached the electrical room and quickly slammed the door shut behind me, locking it on. My hands were trembling so badly, I could barely turn on the flashlight on my phone. As I stepped inside, I heard it, a soft, high-pitched whistling. My blood froze. I knew the rule: if you hear whistling, run to the nearest bathroom and hide until it stops. But I was already in the electrical room. I didn't know what to do. My pulse pounded in my ears and I could feel my knees shaking. I backed into the farthest corner, pressing myself against the cold wall. I could hear the whistling growing louder, closer. It was as if whatever was making the sound was right outside the door. I held my breath, staring at the door, praying that it wouldn't open. The sound of whistling was accompanied by something else now, scratching. The unmistakable sound of something dragging itself across the floor. Then, everything went still. The whistling stopped. The scratching stopped. I didn't dare move for what felt like an eternity. Finally, I crept toward the door and slowly cracked it open. The hallway was empty. The silence was deafening. I didn't waste any more time. I ran. I ran faster than I'd ever run before. I ran out of the research facility. I didn't care if I got a pay cut. I needed to process what was happening. Somehow, I was able to bring myself to go back to work the next night. I desperately needed the money, maybe too much. The nights started blending together, each one more sinister than the last. It felt like the walls of the Scientific Research Institute were alive, watching me, waiting for me to slip. I tried to remind myself why I was doing this. The money, the chance to claw my way out of debt, but it was getting harder to care. He'd catch my reflection in the monitors and barely recognize the person staring back. Pale baggy eyes, hair disheveled, lips dry and cracked. It wasn't just the exhaustion. It was the paranoia. Every creak in the walls, every flicker of the fluorescent lights set my nerves on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was always behind me, just out of sight. He'd spin around in my chair, only to find the empty, sterile room mocking me with its silence. The rules felt like a lifeline, a thin thread keeping me tethered to sanity. I read them over and over, committing them to memory. I couldn't afford to slip up. Not here. Not with those things watching. The encounters kept getting worse. One night, the cameras started to glitch, the screens distorting into bursts of static. I leaned forward, trying to make sense of the warped images. That's when I saw it, a pair of black eyes staring directly into the lens of camera 4. They weren't human. They were too large. The eyes were black voids, an endless space of nothingness. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The eyes stared unwavering, and then the screen turned into static. I scrambled to check the other cameras. Hallways were empty. The labs were dark. But I knew it was out there stalking the halls, waiting for me to make a mistake. My heart hammered in my chest as I made sure the booth door was locked, triple-checking it this time. The sense of isolation was crushing. I wanted to scream, to call someone, anyone. But who would believe me? Who could help me? By the second week, the nightmares began. Dreams of faceless men and black liquid seeping into my room, filling my lungs, drowning me. He'd wake up gasping for air, drenched in sweat, my screams echoing in the tiny apartment. He'd stare at the ceiling, wondering if it was worth it, if anything was worth this. One morning, as I was leaving the institute, I saw a researcher I didn't recognize heading in the opposite direction. He was tall and thin, his lab coat pristine. His face seemed a bit odd, too composed, too calm. He gave me a curt nod, but his eyes lingered on me for a moment too long. There was something unsettling about the way he looked at me, like he knew something I didn't. I opened my mouth to greet him, but he had already turned the corner, disappearing into the labyrinth of hallways. The brief encounter stayed with me as I climbed up to the security booth. I couldn't shake the impression that his expression wasn't curiosity or indifference, it was pity. That same night, I swear I heard Scarred's voice outside the booth, calling my name. It was faint at first, barely a whisper. Then louder, more insistent, but I couldn't open the door. Rule 1, never open the door to anyone but Scarred. Was it him? Was it something else? I didn't want to find out. This job was breaking me, unraveling me one thread at a time. Each shift felt heavier, the minutes stretching into hours, the hours into an eternity. But I couldn't leave. Not yet. 3 weeks. 3 total weeks of this hell. I had to make it, no matter the cost. As the days passed, the lines between reality and nightmare began to blur. The Institute's sterile corridors became a maze of paranoia, and the security booth a claustrophobic prison. I could feel the weight of the rules pressing down on me, the unspoken promise that breaking them would mean something far worse than losing my job. You'd like to say I was careful, that I'd been doing everything right. But the truth is, the job had worn me down. The fear, the sleepless nights, the constant vigilance. It all chipped away at my resolve until I was nothing but a hollow shell going through the motions. The final night started like any other. I was one shift away from finally leaving this hell. I locked the door behind me, scanned the cameras, and settled in for another long shift. The facility was quiet. Too quiet. Even the usual creaks and groans of the building seemed to hold their breath. Then, the whistling began. It was faint at first, almost melodic, like a child humming a nursery rhyme. My stomach dropped. Rule 2. Run to the nearest bathroom and hide. But I couldn't move. My body felt frozen, pinned to the chair by an invisible force. Whistling grew louder, closer, until it was right outside the door. Then it stopped. A knock. 3 sharp raps. My heart nearly stopped. "Jason," a voice called. It was scarred. I was sure of it. "I am coming in." The door rattled for a second, then the door opened. It really was scarred. I sighed with relief. "So it was really you," I said. He looked at me with an eyebrow raised. "Were you expecting someone else?" "No, never mind, sir," I replied. "Well, everything looks up to standard. I wanted to check in on you. I assume you'll be wanting to quit after tonight." "Yes, that's the plan, sir." "Well, I'll be off. I have some pressing matters to attend to at the lab." He proceeded to walk out and close and lock the door. I heard a few footsteps walk away, then a pause. "Pardon me for a second, Mr. Jason, but I forgot an item of mine within your booth. I need to retrieve it," he said from the other side of the door. Yes, sure. One second." I turned the key and opened the door, expecting Mr. Scarred. However, to my shock, the figure standing there wasn't Scarred. I looked off to my left and watched him walk away without a second thought. Why? Naum? I thought to myself. Then I realized, what was the real purpose of me being here? I couldn't comprehend why he would send me to my death like this. I had no time to think. It was already too late. I looked up and faced the terrifying monstrosity. It was tall, impossibly so, its body twisting and contorting as it stepped into the booth. There was no face, just smooth, pale skin stretched taut over an elongated skull. His presence sucked the air out of the room, filling it with an unnatural cold that seeped into my bones. I stumbled back, tripping over the chair, my mind screaming at me to run, to do something, anything, but it was already over for me. At that moment, I took out a voice recorder and said some final words. The creature waited. It knew it trapped its prey and was savoring every moment. The creature's long, spindly fingers reached for me, pulling me up like a puppet. Its touch burned, not with heat, but with an icy soul-crushing void that drained every ounce of willpower I had left. My vision blurred. My screams died in my throat. The last thing I saw was its featureless face, as it devoured me, not just my body, but something deeper. My essence, my soul. Epilogue. 15 years later, the Science Research Institute was nothing but ruins. The once gleaming facility had been reclaimed by nature, its walls cracked and overgrown with vines. Most people in town avoided it, dismissing it as an old abandoned building with no significance. But not me. My name is Blake, in 16th, and I've always been drawn to places like this. The stories, the rumors, they fascinated me. So when my friends dared me to explore the Institute, I didn't hesitate. The inside was worse than I expected. The air was thick with dust, the floors littered with broken glass and old papers. I wandered through the empty halls, flashlight in hand, feeling a strange mix of excitement and dread. That's when I found it, a security booth. The door hung off its hinges, the room inside untouched, as if frozen in time. Monitors, now shattered and rusted, lined the walls. On the desk, half buried under a pile of papers, was a small cassette recorder and a journal. I picked them up and brushed off the grime and dust. The tape inside was labeled Recording 12, final words along with the journal having a name written on it as well. Jason. I pressed play on the recorder. First I heard static, then a voice. "If you're hearing this," the voice began, trembling but resolute. "Then you've discovered the truth. The Research Institute isn't what it seems. The scientists, the researchers, they aren't human. They're monsters. They lure you in. They make you follow their rules. And when you break them, they'll take everything." There was a short pause, followed by a shaky breath. Don't make the same mistake I did. Whatever you do, stay away from. The recording was cut off by a scream, followed by a low, guttural sound. Something that sent chills down my spine. I looked around the room, the shadows seeming to press in closer. Suddenly, the air felt colder, heavier. I dropped the recorder and ran, the echo of Jason's warning chasing me out into the night. Was the building truly abandoned? Truly devoid of life? The mystery of the events that unfolded 15 years ago are eerie, and the building itself is foreboding. I am posting these entries from Jason as a warning. If you ever see a job entry with a list of abnormal rules, run. 1. As the boy ran out of the building, a man in a suit and tie could be seen sitting down on a park bench in the distance. The man had his legs crossed and was reading a newspaper while smoking a pipe. The man lowered his newspaper and looked at the boy running away from the abandoned research facility. The man chuckled to himself. It seems like it wasn't over after all. I guess the experiment. No, this game shall continue. Mr. Scard smiled ever so slightly. Oh yes, indeed, this shall be quite fun.